Hey, this is X-Cult Baby, and today I wanted to tell you my story. My story about how I left Jehovah's Witnesses and how I came to be an atheist. I've done a lot of interviews on various channels, and in some of my videos I've told parts of my story, but I've never told all of my story in one video on my channel. So, that's what I'm going to do for you today. It's a very long story, so I'm not actually going to be editing this video. I'm actually going to be reading my script right off of my phone, because, otherwise it would just be hours long to edit, and that would be crazy. Plus, I feel like since this is a very personal story, being able to, read it off as I go, as I've put the words down, natural, unedited, I think that just fits with what I'm trying to do here today. Alright. I'm the second of 3 siblings. A younger brother and an older sister. My parents are both Jehovah's Witnesses, and when I was born, all of my family were. My grandparents and my aunts and uncles and cousins on both sides of my family. So, me and my siblings were all born 3rd generation Jehovah's Witnesses. I came to consider my religion to be the most important aspect of my family heritage. My cultural or racial or where I live, anything like that, none of that mattered to me as much as my religion did. My father has been an elder for about as long as I can remember, so we were always held to high expectations of spirituality. We went to the meetings and field service regularly, and we even had book study lessons at our house. We had family worship night once a week, and prayed before every meal and before bed. As far as just about any other witnesses could tell, we were a model spiritual family. My siblings and I were all homeschooled for at least some of our education. My sister and I were both homeschooled until our junior years of high school, but my brother stopped being homeschooled much earlier due to needing special help because of some learning and vision disabilities. I was a smart kid, and I loved learning. I also had ADHD, so it was much easier for me to thrive in an environment where I could do things at my own pace. I remember going through flashcards of my multiplication tables while walking around in circles around a chair. I was always hungry for knowledge, and my parents always encouraged that in us. My dad taught me how to use a dictionary to look up words I didn't know, and my mom took us to the library at least once a week and read to us every night before bed. As a result, I had a big vocabulary and a passion for learning. My true love was for science. I wanted to know everything about the world around me, especially about animals. I liked being homeschooled, but I didn't like the social isolation that came with it. I wasn't allowed to play with the neighbor kids because they weren't Jehovah's Witnesses, and they would be a bad influence on me. When we attended co-op homeschool groups, I wasn't allowed to have playdates with any of those kids either. I was, however, expected to preach to them. I was taught to preach pretty much from the moment I was able to hold a pamphlet and say, "Please read this important message." Even before that, my parents took me with them whenever they went door-to-door preaching. Children my own age sometimes avoided me because I preached to them, and their parents told them to stay away from me. I did have a few friends who were Jehovah's Witnesses, though. I had my cousin, for one, and my friend Micah, who was also homeschooled and went to the same congregation as me. I never really got close to the other kids in my congregation. None of them were homeschooled, so they all saw each other at school every day. I saw them once a week at congregation meetings, and even then I usually enjoyed talking to adults more than my own peers. I didn't really understand how to interact with other kids my own age. I was socially stunted. On top of that, I wasn't medicated for my very obvious ADHD until I was 10, so I had a reputation for being wild and crazy and weird. As I grew up, I only became more devout. My faith was very strong. The only problem was that I was still a hyperactive little kid with no impulse control. I fought with my little brother constantly, and I didn't like sitting down and reading and studying the way that Jehovah's Witnesses are expected to. I loved reading, don't get me wrong, but I loved reading things that actually interested me. Books and magazines about animals, fantasy, science fiction, things like that. I also couldn't sit still or pay attention at congregation meetings. Looking back, it's bewildering that they expect small children to sit quietly and pay attention for 2 hours to talks and sermons about the Bible and theology. So, despite how devoutly I believed, I always had to struggle as a Jehovah's Witness. I was expected to read and meditate on the Bible every day, read the daily text every day, do personal study regularly, prepare at least 3 comments for the Watchtower study every week, prepare at least 3 comments for the book study every week, prepare a presentation for field service every week, and sometimes prepare a short demonstration of preaching to do on stage at the meetings. It was exhausting and time-consuming, and 95% of the time, I just couldn't keep up with that kind of demand. Even as a child, I felt like a failure for not doing what was expected of me over and over again. I was taught that if I prayed and had faith and really gave it my all, that it was possible. After all, I had Jehovah helping me, so if I was failing, it must have been my own fault. Jehovah doesn't ask more of us than we can do, so apparently, I wasn't trying hard enough. When I was 11, my family changed congregations. My dad had always been a pillar of spirituality, and there were a lot of people who were sad to see our family go. We moved to the local American Sign Language congregation and began to learn the language from one of my aunts, who was an ASL interpreter and was already in the ASL congregation. So now, on top of all the responsibilities I had as a Jehovah's Witness, I also had to do half of them in a language that I was only a novice at. But I really loved the deaf community and sign language. Of my siblings, I was by far the most excited to join the ASL congregation. We were the only kids in that congregation, however, which only made my social isolation worse. As a preteen, I made a few more friends among Jehovah's Witness kids I met at conventions, but most of them lived at least an hour away. So since I didn't have a cell phone, I started using the internet to communicate a lot more often. I also played a lot of games online. The biggest thing that shaped my online life was Tumblr. It's a blog website that's notorious for its fandoms, social justice warriors, and extreme toxicity. That's where I first really became exposed to the LGBTQIA+ community. Well, that and my volunteer job at the local zoo. I was in that volunteer program for about 4 years, and I loved it. The people there were amazing, and the work was enjoyable and satisfying. Many of the kids I met there were queer, and this was my first time being surrounded by people my age who didn't make me feel like an outcast and were patient with my social awkwardness. Even though I always had to decline their invitations to hang out outside of the zoo, they still treated me like a good friend. When I tried to preach to them, they would turn it into an open discussion about religion and belief. These were people I felt that I could truly be myself around without fear of judgment. I got baptized as a Jehovah's Witness when I was 15. 15 is pretty late for kids who are raised in the religion, especially for an elder's daughter. Since I was maybe 11 or 12, people asked me all the time when I was going to get baptized. Later, this question turned into, why wasn't I baptized yet, or what was holding me back from getting baptized? I don't think anyone ever actually asked me if I wanted to be baptized. It was always the expectation that I would get baptized. I met my first boyfriend shortly before I started 11th grade. He was a volunteer at the zoo. He was funny and charming and very obviously into me. By this time, I had a cell phone and I texted him regularly. Of course, I had to keep this a secret because I wasn't allowed to date until I was old enough to get married. I had several secret boyfriends and I got caught every time. I became the problem child. When I was 17, my parents even made me quit my volunteer job at the zoo because I'd been caught dating another boy who was a volunteer. After breaking up with my first boyfriend and dating another one for a week, I felt so guilty at a meeting that I started crying. My mom took me into a back room and asked me what was wrong, and I told her everything. She seemed understanding enough, but she told me that I would have to break up with him when I went back to school on Monday. I was very depressed the whole day, and I dreaded the idea of breaking up with someone who I didn't really want to break up with. But I didn't really have a choice. I came home from school on Monday night feeling devastated. I went straight up to my room and cried. I didn't get dressed for the meeting that night. I decided that I didn't want to go. This was the first time in my life that I had ever flat out told my parents that I didn't want to go to a meeting. I had always grown up believing that I couldn't just inherit my faith from my parents, but that I had to make the truth my own. In other words, I had believed that being a Jehovah's Witness was my own choice. But that night, when my dad attempted to drag me out of my bed, out of my bedroom, down the stairs and into the car, I found that I did not have a choice. He managed to pull me out of my room, but I clung to the stair banister like my life depended on it, screaming and bawling, and he gave up. My mother and siblings went to the meeting, and my dad stayed home with me. He sat at the top of the stairs, head in hands, and I clung to the banister at the bottom of the stairs for over an hour. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to stand up, and I picked up the phone and dialed 911. I couldn't think of what else I could do. I had been very nearly forced against my will, literally kicking and screaming, to attend a religious service that I didn't want to. I suddenly felt like I wasn't safe or free in my own home. My dad took the phone from me and assured the 911 operator that everything was fine, and scolded me for doing something so stupid. I moved to the kitchen so that if he tried to grab me and force me into the car again, I could hold on to one of the cabinet door handles. He didn't try to move me again. My mom and siblings came home from the meeting early and in clear distress. The only reason they'd even gone after the traumatizing events of earlier that night was because my brother had a talk assignment. They came home as soon as it was over, and he barely made it through his presentation. My siblings were mad at me. My mom was worried about me. I didn't understand why they were siding against me. If they'd just let me stay home instead of trying to force me to go, nothing bad would have happened. I argued with my dad, telling him that I thought that my worship was my choice. He told me that so long as I was a part of this family and lived under his roof, I would go to meetings, go out in service, and participate in family worship. This was a revelation to me. Until now, I was convinced of the illusion of choice. This was the first time I had ever refused to comply, and I was met with immediately Sorry. I guess this part makes me anxious. This was the first time I had ever refused to comply, and I was met with immediate hostility and use of force. Somehow, after that traumatizing incident, I was again brainwashed into thinking everything was fine, and this was perfectly normal and good. I remember one of my classmates reminding me that I had told her that my parents were abusive and had tried to force me to go to meetings, and I outright denied to her face that I had ever said that to her. My cognitive dissonance and denial were off the charts. In my private life, I swore, I masturbated, I had boyfriends, and I talked openly about sex and politics. Then I turned around and turned into the most pious witness I could be around other witnesses. Before I felt guilty that I had to confess to my parents. Before I felt so guilty and that I had to confess to my parents. But now I felt that I had no choice but to hide part of myself. I didn't feel safe. Late in my junior year, I came out to my family as bisexual at a family worship night. My parents talked to me and listened and told me that it wasn't sinful that I liked girls. But they did tell me that it was probably just hormones, and it was probably a passing phase, and that I shouldn't go around calling myself bisexual. At the very least, I felt that they heard and understood me. After that night, the subject was never brought up again by anybody in the family. In my senior year, I became best friends with a trans guy in my algebra class. We became very close, and I thought of him as a brother. I was devastated that he was going to die in Armageddon, and I tried to preach to him to get him to start a Bible study with me. He never flat out told me not to talk about my beliefs with him, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. Still, the guise of me trying to preach to him allowed me to spend more time with him than any other worldly friend I'd had up until that point. After I graduated, I went to the local community college to get an associate's degree as an occupational therapy assistant. Many of my high school teachers were baffled that a student as bright as me with so much potential was only planning to get an associate's degree. Witnesses are discouraged from seeking higher education, so I wasn't willing to go to college for more than 2 years. And I needed a job that I could make enough money to support myself with only part-time hours. At least that was what was expected of me. After all, if I worked full-time, how would I have enough time to be pioneer? I ended up doing well in all of my prerequisite courses, but failed my occupational therapy classes. I decided to drop out after the semester was over. I sank into a deep depression after that. I felt like a complete loser. On top of that, I was still very close to my trans friend and his girlfriend. We would write and talk together all the time. But even with my friendship with them made me feel guilty. I knew I wasn't supposed to have worldly people as best friends, and that they were holding me back spiritually. My parents started putting a lot of pressure on me to find a job. They said if I wasn't in school, I had to be working. My dad even threatened to kick me out if I didn't get a job. Eventually, I did find a retail job, and for the most part, I really enjoyed it. I really liked most of my coworkers, and the work wasn't too difficult and was often satisfying. Even though I didn't have the threat of being kicked out of the house looming over me anymore, I still felt lost and depressed. Now that the job I'd been hoping for since high school hadn't panned out, what was I supposed to do? I was struggling spiritually. The life of a Jehovah's Witness is monotonous and exhausting, and I just wasn't keeping up. I faked sick to get out of meetings and avoided field service whenever I could. I didn't study before the meetings, but knew enough that I could make up a comment on the spot. I felt constantly overwhelmed with all the things I knew I should be doing, and all the things I knew I shouldn't have been doing. I was a weak-willed, miserable failure who was bound to die in Armageddon. After the 2017 convention, I was on a spiritual high, just as I was after every convention. I knew that my friends, who I loved dearly, to the point of being in love with them, were holding me back. So I told them that I had to cut off communication with them. It didn't last long, but for those few days I was more miserable than I'd probably ever been. I missed them constantly. They sent me a long message explaining how much they loved and missed me, and that if I wanted to have them back in their lives, I could be in their relationship. A polycule of 3. As I told them that I wanted that more than anything and agreed, I felt like I was giving up. Satan had won over me with temptation, and I had given up any hope of ever being a real Jehovah's Witness. The difference now was that I had accepted my fate of dying in Armageddon. I was a weak-willed sinner, but at least now I wasn't fooling myself into thinking there was a chance I would ever be a pious and good Christian. For the next 3 months, I kept my relationship a secret, and I did my best to keep up appearances with my family and other witnesses. I knew that eventually I would have to leave home if I was ever going to make our relationship work, but I wasn't making any active plans to move out. I didn't have a car, I didn't have my driver's license, and both my boyfriend and girlfriend still lived with their parents too. Actually, at this point, they were both living in on-campus dorms at their respective universities. I didn't know how or when I was going to leave. I just knew that I would. In October of 2017, I was getting dressed and getting ready to go to the meeting. Before I even made it downstairs to breakfast, my dad stopped me and directed me back to my bedroom. It was a mess, as usual. I told him I would clean it up when we got home from the meeting, but he wanted me to clean it right then and there. I told him I hadn't even had breakfast yet, but he didn't care. He told me it wasn't Christian for me to be so messy. That was the final straw for me. Instead of cleaning, I started packing. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew that I couldn't live like this anymore. Looking back, it seems like such a small thing to get so upset over, but this was on the back of years of micromanaging and guilt cycles and feeling like I was never good enough, never Christian enough. But I wasn't a Jehovah's Witness anymore, and I was sick of pretending that I was. My sister walked in a few minutes later. She told me that our parents had left in a separate car, so I could stop cleaning, and she would drive me and my brother to the meeting. I didn't think my sister would be the one to come and get me. I didn't want her to have to be the first one to find out I was leaving. I told her I wasn't going. She insisted that I had to go. I told her I was leaving. Her face turned red, the way it always does when she's about to cry. She tried to convince me to get in the car and go with her to the meeting. I remembered that night when I was 15, being dragged, kicking and screaming out of my room. My mattress and sheets ended up on the floor, and my bookshelf got knocked over. But it wouldn't be that way this time. I told her to take our brother and leave without me, because I wasn't going to the meeting and she wasn't going to be able to convince me to. If I had known what I know now, I would have done it all differently. I would have had a plan, I would have had a driver's license, and I would have given everyone some time to come to terms with me leaving. And I definitely wouldn't have told my sister first. I know that broke her heart. My boyfriend made some phone calls and arranged for one of our mutual friends from high school to pick me up later that day, and she and I would go live with her uncle. I was so anxious that day. What I was doing was clearly not well thought out at all. This was a life-changing decision that I had practically made on a whim. Still, I was determined to go through with it. After the meeting was over, my family came home. My siblings weren't talking to me. My parents were angry, but that soon turned to sorrow when I told them that I'd already made arrangements to stay with someone. They realized that I was serious. Members of my family and friends came over to try and convince me not to leave. My uncle actually gave me the "there are two wolves inside of you" talk. But there was nothing any of them could say that was going to change my mind now. For years now, I had no motivation to live. I couldn't see any future for myself except for being destroyed by a fireball raining down from the sky. There was nothing left for me to stay for. Even the hope of seeing my dead grandfather again seemed hopeless, because I'd tried so long to be a good witness and I just couldn't do it. If I was going to be killed in Armageddon, at least I would spend the short remainder of my life being true to myself and trying to be happy. I deleted almost every phone number in my phone that belonged to a Jehovah's Witness friend. I didn't want to be tempted to call or text them, because that would only make things hard on them unnecessarily. When the car arrived to take me to my new home, I said goodbye to my family. My mom was sobbing. My dad was stoically silent, but obviously upset. My sister begged me not to leave. She was in her bed with the covers pulled up over her head. She asked me what she was supposed to live for if I wasn't there with her. My brother met me with hostile indifference. When I hugged him, he didn't hug me back. He told me what I was doing was stupid. Later that day, he texted me, telling me that what I had done was wrong and that I had devastated my family. He told me that he had planned on committing suicide that day, but that he decided not to because my family was already so distraught. He said he would be better off than I was, even if he had killed himself, because I was spiritually dead, and that was far worse. My new roommate and her uncle were great. Her uncle was gay, had a cockatoo, lots of art in the house, and he was a retired professional chef. He was exactly the type of eccentric old queer person that I wanted to be someday. That night was tough for me and my roommate. We shared a room and a futon. She had her own reasons for moving out of her parents' house and living with her uncle. We were both in a pretty vulnerable place. I came out as pansexual on social media pretty quickly. I just wanted to stop hiding and suppressing myself, and now I didn't have to. The next day, I stayed the night at my boyfriend's dorm. He made sure to make sure that his roommate was somewhere else to stay that night. The sex wasn't all that exciting, but it was my first time and only his second time, so neither of us had high expectations. I expected to feel gross and empty afterwards, but I didn't. Nothing about me had changed just because I'd now had sex. The next day, my aunt had offered to take me to the zoo with her and have dinner. My aunt and I had always been close, ever since I was a little kid. Of course she was worried about me. I agreed, and she picked me up after my shift at work. Since I worked in a retail store that sold makeup, I had one of my co-workers who worked in the makeup department cover up the hickeys on my neck. My aunt has a way of getting things out of me. She makes me feel guilty without directly trying to guilt me. I ended up confessing to her that I had committed a serious sin. We had dinner at her house, and I sat down with her and my uncle and told them what I had done. They told me that I would have to tell my congregation elders, or they would tell them. I agreed to talk to the elders after I'd talked to my parents about it. This is getting hard. Sorry. The Judicial Committee was a few days later. My dad took me to the Kingdom Hall. As we drove up, he told me that when this was over, I should thank the elders for doing this, because it's the most difficult thing they'd ever have to do. I went into a back room with the 3 elders from my congregation. I asked them if my dad could be there with me during the meeting, and they said no. They didn't just ask me what I did. They asked me who it was with, who else knew about it, if I had intended for it to happen, who initiated it, who ended it, how long we did it, and for the exact details of who did what to who. It was extremely humiliating and uncomfortable. These men had known me since I was a prepubescent child, and now they're interrogating me about how I lost my virginity. The last question they asked me is if I felt sorry for what I'd done. I thought about it before answering. I said that I felt embarrassed about telling them about it, but I didn't feel ashamed for having done it, and that I would probably do it again. They sent me out of the room to sit with my dad while they deliberated. I already knew what their decision would be. The whole point of a judicial committee is to determine whether or not I'm truly repentant of my sins. I told them outright that I wasn't. There was no question in my mind that I would be disfellowshipped. My dad and I sat in silence for a while. He finally broke the silence and asked me if this was his fault, if he'd been a bad father. I told him it wasn't his fault. I told him he did the best he knew how to do, and I meant it sincerely. As a Jehovah's Witness and as an elder, he did the best that could have been expected of him. Could he have been a better father to me? Yes, definitely. Could he have been a better Jehovah's Witness father? Probably not. I now had a week before my disfellowshipping would be officially announced. I had to tell one of my best friends that I was going to be disfellowshipped. We both cried, but I told her that I would be back. I told her that when the relationship I was in ended, I would have no choice but to go back home. I fully expected the world to ravage me, and when I'd hit rock bottom, I'd be able to shape up and be the good witness I had to be. About a month after I'd moved out, me and my boyfriend and girlfriend broke up. The two of them ended up getting back together briefly, and I was heartbroken. I was afraid that I had risked everything, and I had nothing to show for it. After the initial shock of the breakup, I realized that I still had no desire to return to meetings or become a Jehovah's Witness again. So, I didn't go back. Not long after that, I matched with a guy named Nathan on Tinder, and we immediately got along great. We had an amazing first date and have been together ever since. I found out pretty much right away that he was an atheist. I was relieved by that, since I had absolutely no desire to be pressured into going to another church or returning to my former faith. There were nights when I would be up late sobbing because I was going to die in Armageddon, and I was sinning, and I was wrong, and I deserved to die. Nathan did his best to help me cope with that, but he had never been indoctrinated to believe some of the crazy stuff I believed, and he wasn't sure how to help me. Sometimes we talked about my former faith, or just Christianity in general. He wasn't trying to raise doubts in me, but he did. My cognitive dissonance was so strong that most of the time I refused to think any deeper on a subject if it raised any questions. When I did have answers to his questions, I realized even as I was saying them that they weren't satisfying answers. More and more questions and doubts were being raised, and even though I didn't confront any of them directly, they still piled up in the back of my mind. Sometimes Nathan watched a YouTube channel called The Atheist Experience. He usually turned it off if I was around because he thought that it wouldn't interest me or might offend me. I insisted that I didn't mind him watching it around me and that I wouldn't get offended. In truth, I was curious. One day after he'd picked me up from work, we were listening to an episode in the car. It was early spring, probably March or April. The episode Nathan was watching was hosted by Matt Dillahunty and Jamie Boone. Season 22, Episode 9. He asked me if I wanted him to turn it off, and I told him I didn't mind if he kept it on. The caller was Amanda from Lynchburg, Virginia. She didn't understand how anyone could be an atheist. The call went on to be nearly half-hour long. Both hosts explained briefly their own journeys out of religion and why they're atheists now. The caller explained that she was a believer because of a supposed medical miracle that saved her grandson's life. The hosts questioned her on how she concluded that it was actually her God that made his cancer go into remission, as opposed to a myriad of other possible explanations. They made the point that any time mankind has searched for an explanation for something that they attributed to God, the answer has never once turned out to be God. She told them she had faith that she would see her dead loved ones again. I thought back to how long the only thing that kept me trying to be a Jehovah's Witness was the hope that I would make it to paradise and see my grandfather resurrected. What the caller said resonated with me. How could I not believe that I'm going to see him again? How could I go on living without that hope? Matt Dillahunty responded with empathy, recognizing that after living your entire life convinced that you'll see your dead loved ones again, the prospect of that not being true is terrifying. He went on to say that religion does a disservice to the grieving by making people believe that the people who have died aren't really gone, so they don't actually have to reconcile the harsh reality of death. I know that we listened to more of the call after that, but that was the point where I was in tears. Matt was completely right. I hadn't been able to get over my grandfather's death because I was convinced I would see him again. Millions of people believe that. They have to come up with stories and reasons and hope so that they don't have to confront death. It keeps people from coming to terms with and coping with death. And it's part of almost every religion on the planet. Every doubt and question that had been piling up for months in the back of my mind came flooding back to me. If Jehovah can stop evil, why doesn't he? To prove himself to the world? For his own ego? Why would he put the tree in the garden in the first place? Why even create the possibility of sin and death? Why do I even believe any of this when it's so clearly detrimental to my mental health? I didn't have a good reason to believe any of it was true. Not a word of it. None of the programmed responses I had memorized over my lifetime were good answers. It just didn't add up. Nathan paused the show and asked me why I was crying. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I'm pretty sure I told him that I was an atheist. Even though it was a huge shock to the system, it was also a huge relief. I never worried about being killed in Armageddon anymore. I didn't worry that I wouldn't see my grandfather again. I didn't think of myself as a weak-willed failure. I watched as much of the atheist experience as I could. I heard so many of the arguments I'd used over and over through the years being easily refuted and rebutted. I took another look at the Bible stories I'd read growing up and realized that not only was all of it bullshit, but it was also awful. I felt a freedom that I never had before. That was when I finally started living, and I finally freed myself from the cult that I was raised in.